Hello and welcome to this video where the subject is the histogram in Adobe Camera Raw. In all of my video tutorials, in the interests of trying to make learning a little bit easier, I try to steer you around all of those tools and techniques that you don't need yet. However, there is one that's going to be very important to you. It's the histogram. The histogram is a bit of a mystery, sitting right up at the top right of the Adobe Camera Raw window, but it's going to be well worth our attention. The odd thing about what you're viewing here is I've covered up an image that I currently have in Adobe Camera Raw, so we can see the histogram and all the sliders are set at their default level, but you can't see the image that goes with the histogram. I'll reveal that in a moment or two. The histogram gives us a graphic picture of the tonal range within the image we have open. I think that we can think of the histogram a little bit like sat-nav in our car, because it's going to guide us to the editing sliders we need, like exposure, highlights, shadows, whites and blacks. And it also gives us guidance on how far we may wish to move those sliders. The thing is, it just takes a little time for us to develop a correlation between the image and what the histogram shows us. But if we take a look at the histogram every time we open up an image and we allow the histogram to be our guide, you'll be surprised how quickly you develop that correlation between the two. So in the interests of trying to kick off our learning about the correlation between the histogram and the image, that's why I decided to open an image but just cover the image so we can just view the histogram. What is the histogram saying to us as we look at it? If we move the cursor up into the histogram, if I go to the center portion, you can see a shaded area. There's another one to the right and one further to the right. So in all there's 5 shaded areas. As I move over those areas, you can see a word appears just below my cursor. When I'm in the center, you can see the word is exposure. And if you look further down the sliders, you'll see we actually have a slider for exposure. When I move to the right, you can see this area is the highlights in the image, and we've got a slider for highlights too. And over on the right we've got an area which is labelled whites, and we've got a slider for that as well. And if I go back the other way, well, I think it's going to be fairly natural that we've got shadows and a slider down below, and blacks and a slider down below. So what is this mountainous shape we call the histogram telling us about this image? Well, it's telling me that the image is fairly well exposed. How do I know that? I can see that the histogram reaches the right hand side, so there's good detail in the highlights. I can see the histogram reaches almost to the left hand side, so there's good detail in the shadows too. And I can also see that the peaks are fairly high. So I've got an image on screen here, albeit you can't see it yet, that's very well exposed. Now of course I know what this image is that's currently hidden from you, but even if I didn't, I can tell an awful lot about that image from the histogram I'm viewing. I can tell it's a very well exposed image, and I'm not going to have any difficulties at all in making just 1 or 2 small changes within Adobe Camera Raw, and I'm going to have a good image. So let's reveal it. When you eventually see the image, you can see how that histogram correlates with the image we're viewing. All we've got to do here really is to add a bit of contrast, a bit of colour, maybe a little bit of blacks. To be honest, the manipulation of an image like this is more personal than right or wrong. For example, I may decide to just tweak the blacks a little bit to give it a bit of contrast, a bit of clarity, which is mid-tone contrast as well, a bit of vibrance in the colour, maybe I want to warm up the image, maybe I want to just tweak the exposure, but as you can see, within a very short time I've got an image that's worth viewing. I've opened up another image here and covered it the same as before, and I'll reveal what the image is in a few moments. But look at the histogram at the top right. Look how different this appears compared to the previous one. When we look at the histogram from our hidden image, we can see that all of the tones are stacked up on the dark side. Now that's going to tell us, broadly speaking, one of two things. It's either telling us that we've got a very badly exposed image where all of the shadows are blocked up, and therefore we probably wouldn't want to proceed with an edit of the picture. But it could be telling us that perhaps the image is predominantly dark. This is why I talk about the correlation between the image and the histogram, because we do need to view the image and the histogram together to get a feel for what the histogram is showing us. So if I reveal what this image is, we can tell whether we've got a badly exposed image which we may want to drop in the bin, or it's an image that's just dark in nature and the exposure is perfectly okay. Now you see what I mean about the correlation between the two. As soon as we see the image we say, oh yes, of course, all of the pixels are stacked up on the left hand side in the dark area, but when you look at the picture, well, it reflects exactly what we're seeing in the graph. There's nothing wrong with the exposure here, and all we would need to do is a few tweaks, and most of those are going to be personal. A little bit of clarity, a little bit of colour. We can adjust the exposure, of course, we can adjust the colour, but once again we've got a picture, and the histogram is telling us what we need to do, and to some degree giving us a guide on how far we need to go with the sliders. I've just opened up a new image and it's covered, as you can see, so we can just concentrate on the histogram. But look how the histogram now looks. It's almost a complete reverse to the previous one, where all of the pixels are stacked up on the right hand side. Now I said the histogram is used as a guide because sometimes we can't tell whether the image is badly overexposed or it's just one of those pictures that's naturally light or dark. But if we look carefully at the histogram, it's actually telling us that there's not a lot wrong with this image, so the best guess here is that the image is supposed to be fairly bright. Now I can say that because if the image was badly exposed, the histogram would have a flat area up the right hand side. I can simulate that perhaps by just moving the exposure to the right, and we see everything goes flat up the edge, and I think if we had a picture like this it would be telling us that probably the exposure is way over the top. But when we're looking at the histogram like this, you can see it doesn't quite meet the right hand side, which is an indicator that the image probably is correctly exposed. So I think we need to reveal it. You see, when we see the image and the histogram, there's almost that eureka moment. Ah, yes, I can see the correlation between the two. That is what we need to learn, and if we just look at the histogram and use it every time we open an image, you'll be surprised how quick that correlation starts to form. We've got another couple of areas within the histogram to help us. We've got clipping warnings. If we go up to the extreme top right, we've got one here that says highlight clipping, and I can turn it on by clicking and it will be highlighted with that little white square, and we've got one for the shadow detail. Now we're not going to have too many problems with the shadows here, but I'll turn it on anyway. So now we're looking at the picture. If you look at the headlights of the car, can you see two little tiny spots of red? So what the histogram is telling me here is that over all of this image, the only place I've lost a couple of pixels of detail, in other words there's no detail at all, is just in the headlights of the car, and that isn't significant. But I can simulate what you would see if I'd badly overexposed this image. So let me just move my exposure to the right, and we get to a point where the clipping warning is telling us now that we've got no detail left in that red area at all. Now, as you can see here, I've opened up the previous image, the dark one, which happens to be the door of an old railway carriage which has seen better days. If you look to the center left, you can see a little blue area here and one just to the right. Very insignificant, but what that little area is telling us is the shadows in that area is so dark there's no pixels there at all. If I'd badly underexposed this image, it would look something like this with the histogram clipping warning turned on. Much the same as the highlights, just a different color to denote we're looking at shadows. I'm going to reset that black slider with just a quick double click and it'll go back to its default. Now, it's a personal choice whether we have the clipping warnings permanently on or off. There is a keyboard shortcut. I tend to leave them off and turn them on when and if I think I need them, but I don't want to burden you with too many keystrokes at this particular point. To bring this video to a close, let's just look at a simple cloudscape and the histogram that goes with it. I'm going to turn on the clipping warnings just to be sure, so you can see if I'm going to go too far. We can see the exposure looks okay, but we've got a deficiency in highlights and whites and also shadows and blacks. So why don't we put them right? Remember, the histogram gives us a guide on what we need to do. So we need a bit of highlights, and I can drag that to the right. We need shadows a little bit, so I can drag that to the left. We need whites, I can move that to the right. See the contrast coming up as well. And I've got to go a long way before we get any of the clipping warning telling us we've gone too far. So I'm going to come back to about there. I'm going to put some blacks in to stretch the blacks. See the straight edge going up the left hand side? So we want to try and avoid that in most cases, but there's a degree of personal choice here. But straight away, before I put any clarity into this and any color adjustments, the difference we've made to this image is quite significant. Simple changes guided by the histogram. I'm going to touch the P key on my keyboard, which takes me back to the start and what we did in just a few seconds. I hope you've enjoyed this video, but of course if you didn't, it means I'm sitting here talking to myself. Ah well, never mind. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also hit the notification bell so that you're notified whenever I put up a new video. This video is just a small part of a whole range of videos under the heading of shooting and manipulating raw images. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll find a link to the rest of the videos below. If not, come along to the website you can see on screen.